So, talking about the sort of UK economy in the late 70s, early 80s, and how I sort of compare that with where the Russian economy is today. So, I start with a quote first. The more the state plans, the more difficult planning becomes for the individual. And this is a quote from Friedrich Hayek, who was an English-Austrian sort of economic thinker in the middle part of the 20th century. I've got a few quotes here. The first is, the battle against inflation resulted in the closure of many inefficient factories, shipyards and coal pits. This helped bring inflation down below 10%. Wage growth rose to 3.8%. However, it also resulted in unemployment reaching 12.5% of the workforce. Our industrial performance has been so poor for so long that in Western industrial terms we have now become a low productivity, cheap labour country. The country is now exposed to Dutch disease, the tendency of oil and gas revenues to affect the exchange rate. And this was actually a note from a UK government body to the then Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher in 1979. And I think these quotes are interesting because some of the things they talk about, sort of low productivity, high inflation, lack of investment, Dutch disease from the sort of oil price fluctuation, it seemed very relevant to me, to the Russian economy in the modern day. The sick man of Europe, this has nothing to do with Brexit, by the way. This is a term used to describe the UK in the late 1970s. While other European countries had encountered a post-World War II economic miracle, the UK had gone into a period of steady decline, characterised by the increased involvement of the state in the management of the economy. There's the growth of the welfare state, which actually is actually a very good thing. It has a lot of support. I'm having trouble with the technology. I'm old, so that should be taken for granted. Increased power of trade unions, national ownership and increased nationalisation of industry. So this is kind of factors, some good, some less good, which characterised the UK economy sort of from the period after 1945 to the late 1970s. There's a new government under somebody called Margaret Thatcher, who died about 2 years ago. The economy was in a terrible state. We had an IMF loan in 1976. Inflation reached 16%, similar to the level reached in Russia in the early part of 2015. And productivity was very low. Widespread strikes among workers demanding pay increases. Something called the winter of discontent, where lots of bits of government stopped working. For example, people stopped collecting rubbish from the... Maybe if I stand in a certain place, it kind of works all the time. I think I'll just take it off. If you can't hear me, just put your hand up. Yeah, people stopped collecting rubbish in the streets. There's big piles of rubbish. People stopped collecting dead bodies. You know, it's a terrible time. Of course, I wasn't even born then, apparently, so I wouldn't remember this. But so the new government came into office in May 1979. That was the arrival of kind of post-Keynesian economics in the UK. Have been very much driven by Keynesian economics, kind of fiscal stimulus and so on, up until that point. But then neoliberal economics came to the forefront, guided by this thinking of Hayek, the guy whose quote I gave at the start, particularly outlined in a book called The Road to Serfdom. So one of the first kind of things, which is another interesting comparison with Russia, was that there was a mass privatisation in the 1980s in the UK. There's a huge shift into kind of private ownership of previously state-owned corporations. The legal framework in the UK and the kind of rule of law allowed for a smooth transfer of private ownership. If you compare that with the experience of Russia during the kind of failed Big Bang policies of the late 1990s, where privatisation happened, but without a legal kind of underpinning to ensure that it happened in a smooth kind of way. That legal framework was in place in the UK, which I suppose made that process a bit smoother at the time. And it covered a whole swath of different industrial areas in the UK, from industries kind of which are relevant to Russia, extractives, and British Petroleum, which is now, as many of you will know, 20% owner of Rosneft here in Russia. Amersham International, which is kind of a chemicals sort of type conglomerate. British Aerospace, which is now the largest kind of defence contractor in Europe, which is one of the largest in the world. That was previously a state-owned corporation. British Telecom, Rostelecom, Associated British Ports, sold off ports, lots of things. British Shipbuilder, shipbuilding went. Harland and Wolff, another shipbuilder. Utility companies, gas. They've now merged with Shell, which is another big company involved in the Russian market with a close link up with Gazprom. British Coal, that all went. We hardly produce any coal in the UK anymore. British Steel, hardly produce any steel in the UK anymore. We'll get into the reason for that. Regional water companies, electricity distribution companies, national power, car manufacturing. We were known for producing the worst cars in the world in the UK. Largely by state-owned car manufacturing companies. Jaguar was previously a state-owned company. It's now actually owned by an Indian company, but we still consider it to be British, and all of our British ambassadors around the world, generally speaking, either drive only Jaguars or Land Rovers. Leyland, they've died. Rolls-Royce was a public company, it's now private. Now that has now two very different successful arms, one which produces cars, and one which produces aero engines, actually separate companies. Rover died. Transport companies, bus companies, airports authority companies, British Airways, like Aeroflot, that was a public company, that was sold. Bus companies, go on and on, rail companies, banks. Some of these banks were sold obviously after the global financial crisis, where the government had to kind of bail out private banks, which were at risk of going under and causing major kind of systemic risk to the economy. They've now been sold back or partially sold back into the private sector. Our Royal Mail service, our postal service. So we kind of sold off all these big state companies, and as well as kind of the benefit in terms of shrinking the size of the state and its involvement in the economy and generating much needed fiscal revenue for the government itself, there's a mass encouragement of shares, so normal people just having shares. And again, this harks back interestingly to this more negative experience in Russia in the late 1990s, where there were various kind of coupon schemes and pyramid schemes which are actually not successful in that particular context. In the UK, it's arguably a bit more sort of successful, although lots of the shares kind of went into obviously pension funds as well. 32 billion, this is in kind of 1980s money, not today's money, was generated through kind of share ownership. I bought shares, I think, I bought shares in various companies. That's the equivalent of 3 trillion rubles, or 5.6 trillion rubles at today's prices. Another interesting development was a huge movement of social housing into private hands. For a large part of the kind of 20th century, there's a big movement on the back of kind of the emergence of a whole wide range set of welfare issues in the 19th century, the provision of social housing sort of by the state, to the point where kind of a significant proportion of the nation's housing stock is actually owned by the state, by local councils, and a right to buy scheme was sort of set up, which encouraged people to buy their state-owned house at a huge discount, and it proved to be tremendously popular at the time. So there's a huge shift of housing into private hands. 1.5 million houses were sold. There's also kind of a local revolution in other ways, in terms of the local governments shifting how they kind of operated. Suddenly, doing things in the private sector was the in thing to do. So everything from sort of waste collection to human resources services, and so on, to these days kind of IT provision and so on. There's a gradual shift into local councils increasingly kind of what they call tendering for the provision of those services by private companies. So this encouraged kind of competition to get these kind of quite lucrative kind of local contracts, and you bring in companies with stronger kind of management systems and processes, better able to kind of manage the delivery of those services. There are various pieces of legislation, I won't bore you with them all, but there they are. So for most local authority services, the local authorities would have to compete with private companies to be able to continue to provide those services. construction, building maintenance, refuse and street cleaning, school and hospital catering, management of sport and leisure facilities, libraries and theatres, all sorts of things shifted into the private sector. And then, having sold off large bits of the state and introduced more competition in terms of the delivery of services at a local level, the UK started to move towards making the civil service, public services generally sort of inefficient compared to the private sector comparators. I say that I am a public servant, I apologise for that. Generally speaking, but there's a big move to kind of reform the civil service, initially called the next steps in making our civil service better. Have established efficiency units, had a RANEPA review, which kind of looked to the setting up of various agencies. What previously were called government departments was sent off into these kind of agencies where they were given money by the government and had to manage their own affairs and manage them efficiently, so there's less kind of control from London over the delivery of what were previously kind of state-run, they became quasi-state-run services, but apparently in a more efficient way, able to control budgets, set salaries, deliver efficiencies. Obviously, budgets were capped. Oh, so believe it. Okay, finished. Read the W, I guess. See what I've got. So 73,000 state employees are transferred into independent agencies, producing passports, for example, and driving licenses and various other things. So we've kind of sold off bits of the state, we've kind of had more competition for public services, we've kind of set up agencies, and the kind of macro, I suppose, side to this was that the government had abandoned this commitment to full employment. Whereas in the past we tried to employ as many people as we could, that in practice tended to lead to consistently high inflation. And as part of the new monetarist approach, we ditched that commitment to full employment and focused on reducing the inflation rate as something that over the long term could drive economic growth. Monetarist policy, much as the Russian central bank is actually doing today, through Elvira Nabiullina, voted world's best central bank governor last year, very much focusing on inflation targeting. In Russia, we've seen a real shift from kind of interest rate sort of management to kind of inflation rate management over the past kind of 2 years. But what this did was spark a kind of huge deindustrialisation of the UK economy, which really kind of commenced in the early part of the 1980s. And our economic shift, I suppose, has been characterised by deindustrialisation and a shift towards a kind of more investment-led economic model, service-based economy, death of manufacturing industry, and so on. And these are the sort of big challenges, I suppose, questions which in Russia the government is facing in terms of how do they shift, what direction do they want to take the economic model of Russia in. The government no longer tried to be the universal provider and the universal oracle in terms of having all the answers to the day-to-day affairs of the economy and how people kind of live their life. Unemployment grew to 3 million people, which was the big sort of legacy of what people call Thatcherism in the 1980s. The debate has moved on really from them in terms of, I think there's widespread acceptance that harsh monetarist policies, over the long term are sort of not necessarily positive because they can prompt widespread social effects. And we've seen actually growth in terms of social democracy, where some European countries, in particular Scandinavian countries, have been able to live with this balance between provision of services but also having sort of fundamentally capitalist economic models, like Sweden and Denmark are a good example of that, and prudent economic management, where they also having done all those two things, keep inflation low, keeps growth at a sort of an acceptable rate, and so on and so forth. So that's kind of an existential one, I suppose, kind of challenge for any economy to try and get that balance. The UK, I don't think we necessarily have it. I don't think Russia has it at all. So we see the impact for us, the UK, in terms of our manufacturing industry, and this is the same here for Russia, where traditional industries kind of continue to sort of roll on, often not under state control, in sort of single industry towns, and so on. Manufacturing accounted for 30% of UK GDP in 1980. Manufacturing accounted for 30% of UK GDP and employed 6.8 million people. In 2010, it accounted for 11% of GDP and employed only 2.5 million people. So you see there's been a huge kind of shift in the UK. I should imagine if you were to look at manufacturing employment in Russia, you'd see kind of that level of similar, if you include the extractives industries and oil and gas and so on, to be kind of similar, if not higher rate than it was in the UK in 1979. The UK is now an importer of capital, so whereas we used to be a net exporter of goods, Russia today is a net exporter of goods. Russia hasn't run a current account deficit since 1997, and even then it was a tiny, tiny amount. The UK used to be a net exporter of goods, often low quality goods, has to be said, the shame of it, but now imports capital. So in 1970, foreign direct investment in the UK was 1.8 billion pounds. In 2011, it was 54 billion pounds, a 257% increase in real terms. So kind of huge growth in the attraction of FDI, largely into kind of manufacturing for export. So, for example, companies like Nissan coming in and setting up as one of the earliest projects in the northeast of England and exporting Nissan cars throughout Europe and also actually to Russia. A very successful market for Nissan is Russia. But also into kind of financial services. The City of London became the most attractive financial centre in the world last year. Whether it continues to be next year remains to be seen after the Brexit vote. So as we exported less, we attracted more capital, and this is one of the existential questions for Russia. Russia kind of always has its strength, an ability to export largely oil and gas more than imports. But one of the consequences of that is that the flows of capital into Russia tend to be low by international standards, and low by emerging economy standards, very low by emerging economy standards. The levels of investment in Russia are about EU levels, EU being advanced developed economies, Russia being an emerging economy. There's quite a big mismatch when you compare, say, Vietnam, which has 35% investment, China over 50% investment. Arguably China invests too much, but that's another question. We have the most advanced capital markets in the world, more advanced even than the Americans at the moment. I said London's the number one finance centre. We've also moved into kind of service sectors, leisure, retail. The UK is a huge tourist destination. People love coming to the UK, they love our history, they love our monarchy and various other things. They don't love our weather necessarily, but they like many other things. Besides, it's one of the challenges for Russia really, that Russia does actually have huge tourist potential. It's a great country, so many beautiful places to visit. St. Petersburg's one of my favourite places in the world, Ekaterinburg's another. I'm going there in 2 days' time. But I mean, that's another kind of service sector where I think Russia could really grow over the long term, with some work needed on things like visa processes and to make it a bit easier and less kind of laborious to actually visit here compared to say going to Dubai or Southeast Asia, where it's very easy. Creative industries also generate 74 billion annually for the UK economy, so things like Game of Thrones. Game of Thrones, a HBO production, helped to revitalise the kind of economy of Belfast, which had been one of those cities that had really suffered from the deindustrialisation. Harland Wolff was a Belfast-based shipbuilding company, built the Titanic. Now in that area where ships were built, Game of Thrones is filmed, and that's bringing new types of growth into kind of previously sort of struggling towns that have felt the after effects of the deindustrialisation from Thatcherism. And that's a theme you see throughout many parts, not all sadly, but throughout many parts of the UK, where sort of cities like Dundee and Hull and Liverpool, Plymouth, Cardiff, have really kind of developed their economies, often in collaboration with strong universities in those areas, to kind of develop new kind of creative industry ideas on all sorts of things, from fashion, IT, film, theatre, and other kind of areas. So other reforms. So we had National Health Service reforms. We had one of the good things came out of the kind of our economic decline after the Second World War was we did introduce the National Health Service, which is a fundamentally good thing. It's something that has a high level of support in the UK. You can have any sort of healthcare within reason for free in the UK. It may not be as necessarily as good quality as going to the private sector, but it's readily available to everybody. Sometimes we have to wait for a bit longer for certain operations, but it's fundamentally a good thing. But it grown so much and developed normal bureaucratic inefficiencies that was taking money out of, if you like, actually healing people and putting more into filling out forms and doing admin management and so on. That some NHS reforms have happened. Introduction of an internal market, again bringing competitive forces into the delivery of health. Separation between purchasers and private purchasers and providers of goods. So, for example, a doctor, a general practitioner, a doctor in the UK is now a purchaser of a good. So, he has a budget depending on how many people he treats in his surgeries. That gives him a budget, and he can decide, what sort of medicines they have and how much those medicines which hospitals to kind of send patients to, depending on what sort of condition they have. You don't just have to go to your local hospital. If you have a certain condition, some sort of type of cancer, a different hospital may be better doing that than your local hospital. Doctors can choose, and therefore the money follows the patients. And increasingly hospitals compete to provide the sort of level of service in terms of medical outcomes, but also kind of value for money that really drives reform. Education reform, academics and free schools. This is a very kind of controversial topic in the UK. Not everybody agrees with it, but it's one of the reforms where I suppose the government has wanted to kind of have less central control over kind of the day-to-day activities of schools, and has allowed people to kind of set up organisations, if you like, to establish their own school that works to the national curriculum but is largely independent from the state. That's a new, as I say, still contested development. Introduction, an even more controversial issue, was the introduction of something you may have views on, was the introduction of tuition fees for university. As we have an English person here, I won't say any more about that. Introduction of council tax, another really unpopular development in the UK in the early 1980s, early 1990s, where giving councils greater sort of revenue-raising powers, still capping their revenue-raising powers to 30% of total spend, but giving them a bit more control, but actually making individuals as opposed to houses. Previously, local tax was on a house, not a person. It became on a person, and that was very, very controversial at the time. So not all reforms are kind of popular reforms, just to point that out. Another really interesting issue, particularly at the moment, is the devolution of government to Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. I spent a lot of time in Northern Ireland organising the G8 summit in 2013, so it's a part of the UK which is sort of very close to my heart, very close, and I'm now wondering whether it'll still be in the UK in 3 years' time, but let's not dwell on that. So in large swathes of UK policy outside of foreign affairs, in which I work, I'm a career diplomat, defence, I just happen to be an economist as well, defence and the economy, nothing was kind of left untouched by this kind of zeal for reform. Defence actually was touched. There has been a reduction in defence spending, although there's been a commitment to kind of cap defence spending as part of our NATO commitment. UK defence spending was 5.8% of GDP in 1980. It's 3% of GDP in kind of 2011. It's likely to stay at about that level. In Russia, defense spending is 3.5% of GDP. No, 4.5% of GDP here, compared to 3% in 2011. So in Russia, defense spending has actually gone up, where elsewhere in the world, defense spending has been sort of going down. So then there's a kind of response to the global financial crisis of 2008 in the UK. There's massive debt. Everybody here will be familiar with that, as people will be in most countries, accumulated following the global financial crisis, leading to widespread bank bailouts. Lloyds, Royal Bank of Scotland, Northern Rock and others. In our case, Lehman Brothers collapsed in the case of the US. The Big Short is a good movie, if anybody hasn't seen it already, to get a watch. I'd recommend that. A new government came in, again a Conservative government came in, or actually is a kind of a coalition government really, with the Liberal Democrats in 2010. And almost like deja vu, we went back to 1979, and there's a huge focus on sort of massive cuts in public spending. They were, in fact, the biggest cuts in government spending since World War II. So actually bigger than those cuts that Thatcher made, because Thatcher didn't make so many cuts, she just sold things off to the state and generated revenue that way. Some government departments suffered 40% cuts in their budget. Mine didn't, but my department is so small that people hardly notice it anyway. Almost 500,000 public sector jobs lost over kind of 4 years. Sort of similar upheaval we're starting to see in Russia today, where there are kind of some pretty major kind of spending cuts happening and leading to sort of widespread job losses across Russia. However, by shrinking the state, we actually sort of produced 2 million new private sector jobs over the same period. Now, again, this is a kind of contested issue. People don't dispute the 2 million number, but lots of people have been employed on what are called zero-hours contracts. So there's been a slight, arguably, a step back in terms of workers' rights, where people are more vulnerable to kind of exploitative employers in terms of the conditions they provide for them and giving no job security and so on. And that's something that particularly affects working class people, but also sort of immigrant workers as well, who've traditionally always kind of been a good source of economic activity and growth for us in the UK. Our government has been shrinking. We've been talking all this time basically to say that we've been making the state smaller. And that's what it all comes down to at the end of the day. That's how you grow your economy. If you believe the monetarist theorists, you have a state as small as possible, and you allow kind of the invisible hand of the free market to do the rest. UK government amounted to 49% of GDP in the late 1970s. This figure reduced to 37% by the late 1980s, but then it jumped back up to 45% after the global financial crisis, after these massive kind of bailouts of the banking system in particular. This actually may also now change under a new Chancellor, but the target was for that level to reduce to 35% by 2019. Although we're going through a process of resetting our economic plan at the moment. So we're now the best performing advanced economy in the G7 group. This shows the disadvantage of writing your presentation kind of 1 month ago. So lessons, what works, what has worked in our experience. Firstly, closing inefficient industry. This is something very relevant for Russia because the number of mono-goroda, single industry towns. So it's a similar sort of challenge that we faced in the UK, reducing the size of the state sector. Again, very relevant here because the number of people who actually work in small and medium-sized kind of enterprises in Russia is very low comparatively. Increasing competition, again, something very relevant to Russia. I'd say, the rule of law and having a stable kind of legal framework helps in that regard, attracting FDI. Russia does okay in attracting FDI, but it doesn't do that great. Developing the service sector, creative economy, I think there's huge potential for that here in Russia, given the highly educated nature of the Russian population. The education outcomes here are fantastic, actually above average compared to OECD countries. So I think there's great scope for that here. Entrepreneurship, entrepreneurialism, SME development, property and share ownership. What doesn't work, just from my UK experience, subsidies. If you have an efficient industry, the best way to sort of improve it is not to give it subsidies, but just to actually give it less budget. I mean, that's how the monetarists would think. Sort of that cold turkey, as it were. A large state sector doesn't work. Protectionism. Import substitution, very relevant topic here, as we're seeing in South America at the moment with what's happened in Brazil and Argentina. They're economies which have kind of very much been along this economic model, but are just now starting to shift very much more towards a market sort of based approach on the back of the failures of the kind of Kirchner and the Dilma kind of governments in both of those countries. Government planning, state monopolies, social provision of housing. It's debatable. My brother lives in a socially provided house, so I have mixed views on that. So, as I say, what I think, this is something I discussed with Vladimir Mao about 3 months ago. It kind of prompted my interest to write this kind of presentation at the summer campus today. I think lots of the challenges Russia has today are very much like the challenges that we had in the UK. Something that McKinsey said in a report not so long ago, that Russia's historic sources of growth can no longer be relied on. The world keeps changing. The things that drove the Russian economic model in the past are no longer the case. So favourable global market conditions for exports. Obviously, the oil price has collapsed. Nobody expects it to go up to kind of pre-crisis levels anytime soon, even though oil demand is set to continue by, according to some estimates, 1.5% a year over the next 20 years. But even so, we're in an era of kind of low commodity prices. The super cycle has ended. So that presents real challenges for the Russian economy. Demographic trends. Whereas demographic indicators were basically stable in the kind of back end of the Soviet Union period, early part of the 1990s, are now quite negative, with an estimated 10 million reduction in the UK, in the Russia workforce by I think it's 2030. Available capacity after the downfall of the Soviet Union, there's massive underused capacity, which actually drove most of the sort of 6.9% average over kind of 10-year growth rates that Russia kind of delivered. Immediately, sort of, after the kind of 1998 period, just when Putin was starting to come to power. Actually, it's a period of huge economic growth, but that was largely about just using up all this massive underused capacity from the Soviet era. That Russia now has no additional capacity. There's a massive need for investment in the Russian economy to find new areas of growth. Russia has many big advantages, one of which I alluded to before. Low debt is another one. Debt levels in Russia are sort of very low compared to, and have become lower actually since the Ukraine crisis and the imposition of financial sector sanctions. Generally low unemployment, an extremely well-educated workforce. As I said, Russia is kind of well above the OECD average in terms of educational outcomes here. It does better in particular on tertiary education than on other sectors, but Russia is a kind of highly educated workforce. Incredible natural resource wealth. It's resource wealth anybody would be glad to have. It's everything from sort of gold, diamonds, oil, gas, wood, anything you name. I suspect Russia probably has it in great abundance because it's such a vast and beautiful country as it is. But as with the UK in 1979, the Russian state is far too large. Space for the enterprise culture is limited by difficult business processes and corruption, unfortunately. General expectation that the state has the answer to all the economic challenges. Russia is becoming more nationalistic rather than internationalist in trade terms. Import substitution is a good example of that. So the challenge is really, I think, going forward, and you can challenge me on this if you don't agree, because I'm just about to finish. So your time will come. That lady who's sleeping over there can finally wake up and maybe ask me a question. Is tackling corruption, ingraining the rule of law, in particular as it relates to kind of business practices. Moving on from the pain of the failed kind of 1990s Big Bang project to a more orderly divestment of state assets under sort of stable, kind of well-regulated rules of the game that everybody understands, including sort of international investors. Improving technical and vocational education. This is something that President Putin has spoken about quite a few times. I heard him speak about it last year at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, and it's a very good point because Russia produces great people in sort of science and engineering, kind of mathematics and so on and so forth. But there's also a real need in Russia for people who are trained in human resources, logistics, law, various kind of practical things which can help in the real world sort of economy as well. Different parts of the kind of supply chain, I suppose. Major infrastructure investment. В России две беды. Duraki and Dorogi. I think actually the problem is more with the roads. I think Russian people are incredibly smart. But there's a real need for major infrastructure investment. I had a very beautiful and relaxing overnight train journey from Moscow to Kazan last night. It was fantastic. It took 12 hours, but I loved it, don't get me wrong. But I mean, having the high-speed Moscow to Kazan line, really improving motorways, interconnecting kind of routes between cities, so it's easier to move goods into marketplaces. Infrastructure in Russia is generally very poor. Urban and regional development as well is another factor outside of Moscow, which and St. Petersburg as well, which gets lots of good investment and a fantastic metropolises. Other kind of cities could also benefit as well from major investment. Investment in health to improve life chances. I think it's interesting. Where Russia does incredibly well in educational sort of outcomes, it does much less well in health outcomes. The life expectancy of Russia is 9 years below the OECD average. So where in the OECD it's 80 years life expectancy, in Russia it's still 71. So I think there's a real kind of scope for Russia to really invest in health provision. And moving on, and it's something that everybody talks about in Russia, moving on from the over-reliance on oil exports to become a major investment destination, which I personally think Russia has the potential to become. So thank you for your attention. I've finished. You can all either now leave or you can ask me questions. It's up to you. I won't take it personally either way, but feel free to ask me a question if you like. Thank you. Somebody please ask me a question. I feel very bad if I have no questions at all. Okay, first at the back.
Thank you for the presentation. And you made mention of the mass privatization in the 1980s, and you didn't really expand on it. So I'm interested because we had not very successful privatization in Nigeria not too long ago. So I just want to know what are the peculiarities of the privatization in the 1980s in the UK.
I think the thing is that the kind of rule of law and having agreed rules of the game so that domestic and international investors understand the rules, they work smoothly, there's proper redress if things go wrong. I think that's what works successfully in the UK. The UK had been in economic decline for a long time, but it still had a very good judicial system that was able to enforce kind of company law. While we've been in economic decline, we were one of the first international economic superpowers. So I suppose a system of kind of corporate law had actually developed quite well, really from the 19th century before that up until the present day. So that kind of really helped. So having good rule of law, I think, is the underpinnings of it. Once it's a level playing field for everybody, corruption won't intervene, and somebody's bank will control the tendering process in which that same person actually wins the privatisation. It's good enough. Then that is really the key rule of law.
A second question would be, what aspects of the economy, which industries basically, did you have this massive privatization?
Well, everything. We privatise, I mean, it's heavy industry manufacturing, like building ships, extractive industries, digging out coal from under the ground. The only real extractive industry that remained was oil, that's in the North Sea. As we move forward, we've kind of gone into higher value kind of energy production, like wind, production, solar. We've become a leader in sort of green technology, and that's become a new area of energy-related growth. So I guess that's part of that kind of higher value transition that we've been making. It's not just about the industries themselves, but actually moving up the value chain in terms of the industries and getting some higher value added production. So, but in terms of the sectors in the economy, no sector was untouched, really, by privatisation. Or can you say your name and where you're from? Can you ask a question?
Yeah. I'm Sergio from Spain, and I'd like to know what is the relation between the oil export and the investment, the capital attraction, the capital import.
Countries that traditionally run a large current account surplus, so Germany's one. Generally speaking, don't need to import capital because they have this kind of the balance of payments is the balance between what you trade in goods and services and what you trade essentially in capital, and it balances down. It's just I won't go into detail lecture about balance payment systems, but essentially they balance, it's meant to balance, with a bit of accounting, jiggery pokery. So essentially, if you import more than you export, say for example in the UK, you create this kind of need for capital that has to be financed somehow, and that gets financed by either borrowing or by investment, different types of capital. Because trade is basically the movement of hard currency. And if you're importing more than you're exporting, then you're generating this kind of deficit of hard currency. So you need to make up for it some other way by either borrowing the hard currency or getting investment in the hard currency. So that's the kind of circle of life that makes the balance of payments work. It's really about the movement of international capital. So when you're exporting more than you're importing, then you don't need to import capital because you're generating lots of hard currency just by exporting things. So therefore you tend to send your capital overseas and invest it in other countries. It's something that's called capital flight. Now sometimes it can be productively invested in other countries, sometimes it can be put away in offshore jurisdictions for tax evasion purposes. But generally speaking, you'll find that capital leaves a country if you have a big current account surplus, and that's what you see in Russia. That's what you see in Germany, but Germany has such a strong economic growth model that actually uses that to its advantage. Its companies have such good balance sheets that they're able to invest anyway, and it's a very advanced economy, so that they can make that work, but Russia doesn't, unfortunately, make it work as well. You and then you. I forgot your name. Why know you're English?
On me or you?
Oh, you're putting your hand up for him, were you?
No, we both put our hands up, but we're wondering who you picked.
I picked you. I don't see his hand.
Okay.
So you're third after the chap at the back.
Bryony, you know where I'm from. So, plainly speaking, what sort of steps would you like to see Russia take in order to face some of the challenges that you have mentioned in your presentation? Do you think privatization is the way, or is there something very different to that you think that Russia should do?
It's what I said at the back end of mine. Doesn't take it from the clicker again. So privatization is one thing, just not privatization, just generally shrinking the state. But it's corruption is something that people often talk about, and it's just corruption. When you talk about corruption, what you're talking about is really the rule of law, and Russia actually has very good laws, but it's the implementation of those laws which is the problem. So the rule of law is kind of a really important one here. For understandable reasons, the kind of what happened in the 1990s with privatization was a complete disaster for Russia, and people remember the pain of that. Rendered lots of people poor overnight by the really corrupt way that it was handled. And people still think about that and remember it. So it's in the national consciousness, but at some point there needs to be a kind of a reckoning with that and start moving on, healing from that, and say, well, actually, it can be done in a better way than that. And the technical and vocational education, I think, is really fascinating and really important here. Building on an already very highly educated workforce, I think that could help a lot. Infrastructure investment, as I said, in such a huge country, there's massive scope to improve transport connections. Health, and when you do these things, when you shrink the state, when you move to a services-based economy, it doesn't mean you export any less oil or gas. It just means that your service sector grows, you attract more capital. Your currency adapts so that actually more of your capital is coming from investment than oil exports. You're still exporting oil, but it's a smaller proportion of your overall GDP, which has grown because of this new growth in other areas, I suppose.
I'm Alex, I'm from Russia. So,
Очень приятно.
Alex from Russia.
Очень приятно.
Мне тоже.
Я знаю.
So, do you believe in the Russian federal program of making special economical zones like in Polis and Skolkovo? Because a lot of experts and a lot of foreign experts suggest that it won't work without special reforms, special and necessary reforms of our government. And as you know, our government don't like such things.
Well, anything that promotes innovation has to be a good thing. So Innopolis gets good reviews from Igor Shchebalov, the Deputy Prime Minister, and everybody knows about Skolkovo. But the only thing I'd say, I mean, I don't criticise them in any way. I think they're trying to do good things, but it's just innovation should be at grassroots level. So you got, because Tatarstan is the most successful region in Russia, arguably in terms of investment attractiveness. So it makes sense that Innopolis should be here. But Russia's such a huge country, there needs to be ways to kind of promote grassroots structures that enable innovation across Russia as a whole. And my only fear about the Skolkovas is that it's kind of like the state trying to do innovation rather than creating the conditions for innovation to kind of flourish in all parts of Russia, in all of the kind of provinces where there's huge kind of potential for new growth. What we learned in the UK was that actually innovation wasn't driven really by London, it was driven by individual cities finding their own solutions to drive innovation, often with the universities kind of linking up with, linking ideas with companies and entrepreneurs who can turn those ideas into something that can be commoditized and marketed. So they're okay, but something more grassroots, I think, to incubate innovation.
My name is Ying. I'm from China. Like you referred to the
Ma.
Ni hao. You referred the revolution, etc. to back to the 20th century. And we also see the Chinese government right now want to do the same thing, because we have this as developing countries, as Russia have the same situation.
Yeah.
Like a lot of the zombie companies, and also we have a large of the state-owned economy.
Yeah.
So right now we see the such as the revolution kind of because she released the regulation on the company and the private company grew up. But because kind of the financial crash in 2008, the UK's GDP dropped sharply, even worse than United States of America. So what do you have some suggestion about how China handled the same situation as UK, because of our country right now faced the challenge right now? Thank you.
I think one of the challenges of the Chinese economy is about its kind of floating its market, so it can become a special drawing rights kind of IMF reserve currency. So that in itself is creating huge challenges for the Chinese economy. But I think, by and large, you're doing it in a gradual way that's kind of, so far, working okay. The big challenge for China, I suppose, is, which we had less, I suppose, in the UK, was this kind of legacy of unproductive investment. There's been so much investment in China, which has driven massive growth for over 30 years since Deng Xiaoping's time, right? That was all driven by investment, not consumption. And there's been an over-investment in making this difficult transition to kind of consumption-driven growth. Is the big challenge for China. But it all comes down to this. It applies the same in China, it applies the same in the UK, and it applies the same in Russia. It's that willingness to let inefficient industry die, and to take the cold hard pain of industries just dying and dealing with the economic and social consequences of that. Because when you let inefficient investments continue, you keep giving them government money and so on, it just means that over the longer term your growth just falls and falls until you become a low growth, low productivity economy. So when it comes down to it, it's just, you have to recognise the pain that will come from it, but actually have the courage to let inefficient industry die. Any other questions?
Hello, my name is Team 11.
Team 11 means nothing to me. So which country are you from?
From Russia. From Counsellor, near Moscow. What do you think about Brexit, and what will happen with the British economy in next years?
I think the British economy will fundamentally be okay. We're sufficiently globalised that we'll be okay. We'll be able to negotiate our own trade deal and so on. But I think in the short term there may be economic consequences for us as the financial markets get affected by the decision to leave the European Union, as we attract less investment because people see the UK as more riskier investment than perhaps in the past. There'll be an adjustment in our currency. That's already really happened or started to happen. But I think the UK economy is sufficiently developed now that it will basically be fine, but it's going to have to go through quite painful at times period adjustment over the next couple of years. The big question is what the electoral consequences of that will be for the government that.
Well, Australia are already rooting for us, aren't they?
Yes.
So, okay.
But I think we'll be able. We've been through harder challenges than this, but my main concern is less economic and political and social, really, because one of the good things about the EU was being able to, the sense of community you have, free movement and so on. I think part of that's been lost a bit, which is a real shame. But I think the economy will basically be fine, but we will suffer some pain in the short term.
Do you think in terms of travelling around the EU, do you think there will be, do you think it will be made a bit easier, or do you think it will just be visas and?
I think we'll find a workaround, to be honest. That's my hope anyway, talking pretty personally now. We've been used to this for so long.
Yeah.
You may have seen the news about the disruption in Dover from very slow French immigration controls over the past 24 hours.
I haven't.
Yeah, so
oh gosh.
I think there may be some short-term difficulties, but I think we'll find some workaround. We already have a border with the EU, as you know, but I think we'll find some workaround with it. Having to apply for a visa every time you want to go for a weekend to Paris somehow doesn't sound like fun.
Yeah.
We have a common travel area with Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, for example. So let's see if we
Maybe
can
something like that. Great, thank you.
Fingers crossed. Any other questions? No? Okay.
In case, for example, if Northern Ireland like to go out of the United Kingdom, do they have such a right? And will you give them freedom?
So of course Scotland has already voted on a referendum on whether it wants to remain part of the UK. The tricky question there is the fact that the majority of Scots voted to stay in the EU. So that presents a different constitutional challenge. It's something that the Westminster government has to discuss with the Scottish government. Our new Prime Minister has been clear that she sees kind of keeping the EU together, the United Kingdom together, as one of her top 3 priorities. So I hope she's successful in that. Northern Ireland is a more tricky question because of the troubled backdrop to the current Northern Irish political settlement, where there's this kind of split between, there's for a long time, many years, almost 100 years, been a split between those constituencies in Northern Ireland which join the Republic of Ireland and those which remain part of the United Kingdom. So it's in many ways it's a more difficult question, but I hope we find some good solution to it that enables the UK to stay united, which is our Prime Minister's priority. Where are you from, though?
I'm from Uzbekistan.
Oh yes, you said.
Soviet Union also was one.
Is Tashkent?
Yes.
Right, no more questions? No more questions.
What do you think would happen with the million of British people living in Spain?
So?
What do you think that would happen with the British people living in Spain? 1 million.
Well, it's the same question what will happen to EU people living in the UK. I mean, I hope we'll find some grown-up solution where, in this globalised world, we can continue to live in other countries and EU nationals feel welcome to live in our country. But I hope that there will be no substantial change. That is just a personal hope. Any other questions? No? Okay. Oh. Yes.
So you live in Russia, yes,
Yeah.
and you speak Russian, I think so already.
You know it.
Okay. So you have experience of living here. And the question is, nowadays the North Atlantic Treaty Organization is coming nearer and nearer to the borders of Russia. And do you think that Russia is a real threat to all the members of this organization?
Well, to be honest, this is a discussion that's been happening since the days of Khrushchev. So it's not a new question. I don't think, to turn the answer around to it, I don't think NATO is a threat to Russia. Russia believes that NATO is a threat. I don't think NATO is a threat. To Russia. I'm here as a diplomat, so I want to promote good relations between the UK and Russia, and that's my aim. I live in the hope of continued peaceful coexistence between our countries. But no, I don't start from the position of thinking that NATO is a threat to Russia. You have to bear in mind that there's been a big people feel anxious at the moment because of what's happened in Ukraine. It doesn't mean that we want to threaten Russia, but people are quite nervous about things. You've got a complete personal opinion. I actually like living in Russia. I like Russian people. I think it's a great place to be. It has its challenges as a diplomat, as you can imagine, but I don't personally, as a British person, feel threatened by Russia, but I understand the quite difficult backdrop to the situation today, the need for continued dialogue. Thank you very much.